Hello. Hello. How you doing? It's nice to be back in Portland. 10 years off, but I'm really glad to be back. This is the first major show up somewhere I've done anywhere in years. And it's really fun to see everybody. So how you doing? You're having a fun show? I do not plan to change that for the next hour, for sure. So since we last met, I put this out. Has anybody heard of this?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. This is Once Upon Atari. Ah, I figured there would be some here. This is my book. Took me years to write it. Just like the Beatles used to talk about. And of course we have the classic Once Upon Atari DVD set, which is entirely different from the book. So much for self-promotion. But there's some things I talk about in the book that are kind of cool. One thing is I invented an acronym, BMOBS, B-M-O-B-S, for Believe My Own Bullshit Syndrome. Right? Because as a therapist now, and many of you know I'm a psychotherapist now, creating syndromes and new kinds of mental illness that I can work on in my practice is a very important part of my job now. But BMOBS is a very interesting thing, in my opinion, because that's one of the main things that created a problem at Atari. We're all familiar with the big crash of the early 80s. Everybody knows that the E.T. video game was the problem with the whole video game industry. Exactly. Of course, people still write to me and say, I don't really think E.T. destroyed the industry. I just want to, the subtitle of my book, Once Upon Atari, is How I Made History by Killing an Industry, right? So, now the thing is, it's ironic, okay? I don't really believe E.T. destroyed the industry, but I still love it, when we call it the worst game of all time. But BMOBS was a big part of that, right? BMOBS was a big part of what it went, because E.T. didn't kill the industry, of course, but E.T. is symptomatic of the kind of thinking that killed the industry. And that's the thing you really need to know about, and that's the thing that as a therapist I was always so interested in about at Atari, is how people think. How does the fastest growing company in the history of American business become the fastest falling company in the history of American business in the space of a couple of years? That's aggressive goal achievement, at its best. And so, but what contributes to that, it takes extraordinary people doing extraordinarily messed up things, right? And that's the story of Atari, right? The story of Atari on some level was a bunch of really talented, high capability, very aggressive people all joining hands together and walking right off the cliff. And so there's a great irony to it. It's kind of fun to think about. It was very weird to live it. And I was one of them, sure. Because, it's a weird thing to think that the most expensive license in the history of gaming at that point was given the shortest schedule by a factor of 5. So let's spend more money than we've ever thought of buying for anything before, and then let's cut development's legs out from under them so we can deliver the product. That's a weird thing to do, right? I mean, in retrospect, in a business state of, like a business mind thing, that's crazy. Why would you do something like that? But the answer is BMOBS. Because there were people in management who didn't know anything about what it takes to make a game, and they don't care. We ask for a game and they give it to us. We're Atari, we make the games. So when we say, give us a game, they'll do it. And that's the way they think, and that's okay, that's what they did. And then there was somebody in engineering who was also just insane enough to say, oh yeah, 5 weeks? I could definitely do that. No problem. So it's a style of thinking, it's a way of going. And you get there because you have had success. right? There were a lot of people who either had or were having tremendous success at Atari. And there's an old saying, you know, that success has 1,000 parents, but failure is an orphan. Right? So when there is a success, there's a tremendous rush to see who can claim the success. And everybody at Atari knew they were personally responsible for the enormous success that Atari was happening. Which is great. That's great until things turn around. Now, when things turn around, that's when you find out who's really responsible for something, right? Because there was a saying at Atari, a guy named Matt Hubbard, my ex-brother-in-law, in fact, he was one of the programmers at Atari, and he used to say that, you know, state-of-the-art, we work on state-of-the-art, right? And the definition of state-of-the-art is that when it's broke, nobody knows how to fix it, right? That's the definition of state-of-the-art. That's why they call it bleeding edge. And it was true. And then when things turned down, they all looked to Ray Kazar, who they all looked to as the progenitor of the success, and said, okay, it's not working, fix it. You know, and then 6 months later, he was fired, and they found somebody else to fix it. And then about, 8, 9 months later, they were fired, and they found someone else to fix it. And then they fixed it by selling the company, and you know the story. It's interesting. It's interesting how things take off, and everybody's responsible, and then things start to fall, and nobody's responsible. Because one thing I have learned a lot about as a psychotherapist is blame, right? Because blame is a very important thing. But there's a famous saying, particularly in relationships, there's an American humorist years ago said, blaming in a marriage is like saying your side of the boat is sinking, right? And it's just, there's a lot of truth to that. Blaming is great because blaming lets us feel like we've dealt with something. We've taken care of it, we've assigned the problem, we know what the problem was, and we've done absolutely nothing to fix it. Well, that's one way to go. But figuring out what's going on, what's really happening, that's more important. And the thing about Atari that was so great was people were so busy blaming each other for what was going on, nobody was really taking the time to figure out what the problem was and fix it. So the people who did that was the next generation of gaming, right? So there was, Atari jumped right in, it was the first penguin syndrome. How many of you know about the first penguin syndrome? You ever heard of that? The first penguin syndrome is that, when all the penguins go marching down to the sea because they all got to stock up with the food to go back to freeze with everybody else because they're going to lay the eggs. So all the seals are waiting because they know the penguins are coming, right? And it's feeding season for them just like it's feeding season for the penguins, right? And so the first penguin that breaks the ice and jumps into the water, they usually get eaten. It's like it's a tough day for the first penguin. But after that, the seals are distracted, and all the other penguins jump in, and they start running around and get the fish, and away you go. But the first penguin, that's a tough one. And Atari really was the first penguin. And they ran afoul of the whole industry, unfortunately. That is not the worst joke you will hear today, I promise. So, B-Mobs also shows up in another way. And that is when you're going to innovate. If you really want to do something new, and the thing that was really cool about being at Atari was we were defining a new medium, right? Our job was to show up and do something that did not exist that day when we got up. You go to work and you create something new. You make something happen that either looks cool or feels cool or nobody's ever seen before. That's a pretty cool job description. I done it. It was really good. But I don't know if you've ever sat down and tried to just make up something brand new, just for the heck of it. It's not as easy as it sounds. It can be tough. So lots of people say, I want to do something new. I want to create something. I want to do something. But to actually make it happen, it's tough. It's scary. It's a lot of work. So what do? So this is the other side of B-Mobs. Because if you're going to really do something, if you want to innovate, if you want to create something new and dynamic, the first step is believing you can do it. But if it's really something that's brand new, that's never happened, how do you know? How do you know you're going to do it? So there is a leap of faith to step into technology and do something brand new. And the thing is, with just technology, actually it's not that tough to do something new in technology, because there's so much technology available, you can put them together in new ways, you can do something new. But doing something new that has some value or meaning, has some use, that's a bigger challenge. And doing something new that's fun, that people just plain like, that's going to give someone a break from all the crap they deal with on a day-to-day basis, which is the way I viewed my job. I don't know that that's going to happen. And when I think it's happened, and when I think I've got it, they bring in a bunch of like 10, 11, and 12-year-olds and give them pizza, and they look at it and they go, ah, this sucks. You know, and they're right, if that's what they think. Those are a couple of tough barrels to stare down when you're really trying to do it. To show up, to be able to show up and believe you can make that happen takes a certain degree of insanity, right? You've got to be a little crazy to believe you can really make something and create it and have it happen. And I and a lot of the people who worked at Atari back then, we all had that. And it wasn't the case that everything we did every time worked. But every step we made, every day we came into work, we came in with that belief. And that was important. Because without that belief, it's never going to happen. So there's the B-mob style where my own bullshit is clouding my vision to the point I'm walking off cliffs and falling on some sharp rocks. That sucks. But the idea that I believe enough in my own bullshit that I'm going to climb the stairs, I'm going to try and climb the mountain and see what's on the other side, and maybe I'll find something, well, that's important. So how do you specialize in one and let go of the other? That's when you come to see me professionally. So, and that's what I do. I focus on high-tech leaders and the super intelligent, is what it says on my website, and also those trying to love them. Because that's not always the easiest thing either. So, another thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is programmer brain. When I say programmer brain, does that mean anything to anybody? Wow. Okay, how many of you have ever programmed? Yeah. Are you familiar with your brain? Here's what I mean by programmer brain, because I think programmer brain is a very interesting phenomenon. So interesting that I can't stand still. I'm so excited to talk about it. I'll be right back.
I'll be left front.
Excellent.
But you never left.
You're right. So I better get centered. So here's the thing. Programmers, most people, you walk around your day-to-day life, there's a thing called habituation, right? Habituation. We get used to our environment. We deal with our environment, and what we do is we have an incredible amount of stimulus all around us all the time. The human brain processes so much stimulus all the time. It's enough to make you need a therapist. Thank God. So, but you really can't process all that stimulus because the human brain isn't that fast, right? It's good, it's got some wacky, amazing capabilities, but it's not really super fast. In fact, human beings, by and large, are low-resolution instruments. We really aren't that well attuned in a lot of different dimensions. That's why we make tools that are extremely high precision, right, to help us out. So, one thing our brain does is it's very good at eliminating stuff, about throwing stuff away. I don't need to look at. I don't need to see this. And because we know how to look at a whole field, throw away all the stuff that doesn't make any difference, and get right down to the key stuff, the important things. And that's what we do. We filter. We know how to screen out. So that's great. Now think about programming. Programming is kind of the opposite. right? In regular walking around, living your life, you're all about, you know, all this stuff that never happens, this remote stuff, this low probability stuff. Screw that. I don't even need to deal with that. All that's going to do is waste my time. I'm going to focus on the main stuff, the stuff that's more likely to happen. Any programmer who does that is not going to be a programmer for very long. Actually, they can keep programming if they want, but they're not going to get paid to program that long. Okay? Because programming is all about figuring out the exceptions, right? When you program, you've got to handle all the exceptions, you've got to handle all the inputs, all the possibilities, because anything you didn't explicitly handle is going to be a bug. Right? So what programmers do, I don't know if we realize we do this, but what we do is we spend all our time figuring out the 1/10% possibility that's going to happen because we got to handle that. So whenever anybody, now here's the problem when you're talking to a programmer if you're not a programmer. When you're not a programmer, you start talking to a programmer, it's very annoying. Why is this annoying? Because as you're talking, the programmer is going to tell you, I don't think that's what you meant, what you said there. Because what you said was, you know, blah, 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 and you know, if I were to do that literally, I think you'd be very unhappy.
Oh God, I'm already hearing it. Ah. I used to live with a guy like that.
Really? I used to be one. Actually, used to is probably not the right term at this point. But so, programmers are all about finding the most obscure, unlikely situation. They look for exceptions, okay? Now, when you spend your life focused on exceptions, you start missing the obvious. See, the people who focus on the obvious miss the exception. But the people who focus on the exception sometimes miss the obvious, and it's very amusing. It can be very funny. Okay? I got a whole chapter in the book called Nerd World Country, where I talk all about programmers and how their brains get screwed up by programming. Screwed up is a strong term, but it gets refocused in odd and uniquely specific ways. And if you're not another programmer and you try to talk to someone who's thinking that way, you're going to realize, what's wrong with you? You know, why don't you just do what people do? Why can't you just be normal? Why can't you just be okay? And the answer is, I am okay. Why can't you pay attention? Why can't you acknowledge these things that I think are important? So there's a funny thing that a lot of technical people deal with called propagation delay. Right? Propagation delay is you hit the button and it takes a little while for it to activate. You know where that was a big problem? Cameras. Right? Cameras, you hit the button, but then there's a delay until the shutter closes or you get the shot. And the people, the little kid was just about to take their first step and you got the picture, and then it didn't take the picture until they fell down. And it's like, oh, I missed the moment. Oh, they had such a great expression, and now it's gone. Propagation delay, a real problem in a lot of cases, right? Especially for people who want instant feedback. That's another great thing computers are good at. Instant feedback, unless they're not well programmed. Because if you program too poorly and you have your response isn't quick enough, we notice it, right? As players, we notice it. If I hit the button on the controller and you don't fire for a moment, how can I play this game? I knew that was the time. It was the exact moment to fire. And it's no good. But I want to tell you a story from the book that's, that deals with propagation delay in a very interesting way. Because there was I worked with after Atari, I went into programming in a lot of other venues. And I was working with some people who'd never programmed games, but they were totally programmers. And they understood the concept of real time and propagation delay. And so another thing that programmers do that's really fun is solve problems. We like to solve problems, right? It's like puzzles. Puzzles are fun. It's immediate gratification. Show me a programmer who doesn't like immediate gratification, and I'll show you a programmer who's probably not really a programmer. So here's the problem. They wanted to go to the movies, and they wanted to be drunk at the movie. Okay? So that's a problem because, you can't drive drunk because they didn't want to do that. They didn't want to break the law. and you weren't allowed to bring alcohol into the theater. So they didn't want to violate the rules. They wanted to play the game by the rules, but they still wanted to achieve their objective, was to get drunk. So in this case, propagation delay really came in handy. So what they did was they got together, had 2 or 3 drinks really fast, jumped in the car, and drove to the theater as fast as they could, and they figured they'll get there before they're drunk, because they were counting on the propagation delay of alcohol entering the bloodstream. Problem solved, right? So that's what programmers do. They look around and they try to find a new solution or an effective solution to a problem that most people might consider never really existed. And they solve it. It feels good. I'll tell you one more short story about this kind of thing. And this is the cabinet story. Right? Because this was me. This was my programmer brain. Because another thing the programmer brain does is it says, I've got to find the optimal solution. I can't just find a solution. I have to find the optimal solution. I have to find the elegant solution. How many of you think elegance is an important part of problem solving? Yeah. Isn't it? We know it's true. So my wife says to me, why don't you move the cabinet from the office to the living room where we can use it? I'm like, okay. Done. No problem. So she comes by like a half an hour later, and I am standing there looking at the cabinet. She's like, what are you doing? And I said, I'm moving the cabinet. She said, no, you're not moving the cabinet. The cabinet is there. You're standing there. Well, I am figuring out the best way to do it. I mean, should I take the games out first? Should I try to move it with the games? You know, should I get rid of stuff on the way? Look at all these things we used to do. It was so great. I mean, what's the best? Once I take them out, should I just take them right to the living room first? Should I dump them here to move the cabinet? There's a lot of things to consider. She goes, no. You take it out, you move the cabinet, you put the stuff back, and you're done. You could have been done already. And I'm like, yeah, but is that the best way? It really got bad when I said to her, you know, maybe what we should do is rent a cart, and then I can put the cabinet on the cart. I won't have to take the stuff out of the cabinet. That'll save a lot of time. And she, you know, she'd had enough of the conversation at that point. So my wife is very good at putting up with this kind of stuff. But it's like, the thing is, I'm willing to spend 3 hours figuring out how to do a 20-minute task in 15 minutes, okay? And that's a mindset that a lot of people don't get, but a lot of programmers do. And so I call that programmer brain. And it's an interesting phenomenon. I just wanted to put that out there to make it explicit so that we can all name it when we do it next time. So there we go. Maybe you recognize yourself in there, maybe you don't. But I do. Yeah, it can get us in a lot of trouble. Think of how annoying it is to people who don't even program. It's like, and one of the big problems we had at Atari was, you know, the acrimony between marketing and engineering. Right? And that's something I go into a lot in the book, because it still happens. There's still this thing about, you know, there's 2 kinds of people in business, right? There's people who make things, and there's people who make money from people who make things. And they're both valid groups of people. They both each have their own objectives, but boy, do they run into each other in bad ways. Because people who make things just want to make good things. We want to be proud of the things we make, because that's what making things is all about. And the people who make money from people who make things don't really care about the thing. They care about the money and moving that from other people's pockets to their pockets. And if you're going to waste time trying to make the thing better, who cares? Just give it to me so I can sell it so we can move some money. You know, and the programmers go, well, we want to make it better. We'll have more sales. And the people who make money from people who make things say, you know, if we don't have something to sell, we can't get the money to pay your salary so you can make it better. They're both valid points, right? They're all good points. And that's what I mean by there weren't like a lot of dummies at Atari. There were a lot of really smart people at Atari. But they all had their own motivations. They all had their own ambitions. There were a lot of very ambitious people at Atari. And after after a little while, everybody was sure they were the ones who made the success. So it was really annoying when these other people want to do something that I don't value, that's interfering with us all succeeding because I'm going to make us successful. Why are you holding me back? That was really happening at Atari. My understanding is that still happens at a lot of companies today. There is still that basic push and pull between technology producers and technology marketers and salespeople. And what do you do when everybody's right but we can't agree? It's a tough thing. I mean, when we all disagree and we know they're crazy, and then it's easy. You just sit there and talk about how crazy they are. But when everybody's right, what do? How do you resolve that? Well, that's a question for another lecture. So, do you have any questions? So I always like to do the Q&A. Yes?
I've heard stories in the past. What were the 505 parties like at Atari?
The 505 parties?
Yeah. I heard at 5 o'clock the Warner executives left, and at 5:05 they would all gather in the office and do drugs.
What you've got is a very watered down, sanitized version of what actually went on at Atari. There were no Warner executives at Atari, for the most part, right? There was, after a while, there were some Warner installed people, and they knew to steer clear of engineering, except they'd give plenty of warning what they did. So I understand what you're saying now with the 505 party. What you mean is the rock around the clock party that basically went on anytime, because yes, drugs were consumed virtually any time, any place at Atari once you're in engineering. And these were great parties. I mean, they were great parties, but they were also productive. What was interesting was that at Atari, the productivity of the party seemed to drop as the scope of the party increased. When you had I'll get you. When they have multi-departmental things going on, the bigger the party was, the more staid and controlled it was. When we had just, some people from our group together to party, those were wild. There were a lot of places, we used to have a saying that, where do we want to have a party once? Because you couldn't really have an Atari party, at least a department party, you couldn't have it twice, right? Because there was no place that had hosted a VCS department party that would have another one. This wouldn't do it. And so the partying was pretty raucous, pretty wild, but so was the work. We were there all the time. We weren't doing drugs all the time. Well, some of us weren't doing drugs all the time. Some people were, but it was everybody had their own style. But you could, because they actually had orders to keep people away from engineering. They got to the point where security was in charge of keeping people, including the police, away from engineering. And we knew it, and we took advantage of that, and it was pretty wild, because we could do anything we wanted to do as long as good games kept coming out. That's an interesting place to be. But I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Yes?
I was just going to ask, so Atari is obviously not the first company to overflow their own market, ruin their own market, and then watch as the market that they help build runs away from them and goes over to Japan, right? It's also not the last to do that. During the 90s, the company, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of this company, it's called Marvel Comics. They did something very similar with the speculators market and the speculators boom on #1 issues. Where do you see that happening nowadays? Is it still in more like media products, or are you just seeing it everywhere? Because I don't think companies have really ever learned this lesson. Maybe we need to slow down a bit and figure out where the actual strength of our company lies, rather than just assuming, as you were saying earlier, that we're all the reason for why we're the success.
Okay, so there's two things going on there.
All right.
One is, Atari didn't flood the market with products that are crap and stuff like that, right?
No, that was other companies, like I Imagine.
Right, but that's an important distinction.
That's fair.
Okay? Because if Atari had flooded with a bunch of crap, that would be one thing. What Atari didn't do was protect the machine. Atari didn't understand the idea. When Atari made the VCS, they didn't realize they were making a modern video game console. They thought they were making a phonograph player, and they thought they were the only people who could make records. That's what happened. It never occurred to them that you could make a game console that could control who plays on it, what cards it'll play. So they made a record player, and they put it out. And once they did that, it enabled other people to jump in and do it. So it was true that there was a glut of crap, right? And that was a major problem. But the reason that was a problem was because for all the technical insight Atari had, they lacked legal insight. You know, then in the second wave, you had people who had no technical awareness whatsoever, but a tremendous amount of legal power. And they tried to operate it that way. And the truth is, you know, if you have the hammer people and you have the saw people, but neither of them are really skilled carpenters, right? You need to have a concert of tools and use them together well to really succeed. So I just wanted to clarify that, because I think that's an important distinction to make.
I think you're right. I think that is an important distinction.
Well, if you think I'm right, I hope you're not looking for an argument. Now, as for the rest of it, part of the thing that I tried to do in this book, because I don't know how many of you know this, but before I became an engineer, before I became a mathematician, before I became a therapist, before I did all the stuff that I've done, I was an economist. I got a degree in economics. So when I got to Atari, the whole economics of things stuff was very interesting to me also. And so that's why, you know, what it took me so long to write this book, because I really had to organize my thoughts, because I wanted to give you the story about the crash and the mentality that went to it from the point of view of an engineer, of a marketer, of a market communications people, of an economist, and of a psychotherapist. All of those perspectives really come into play, especially the psychotherapist one. Because let me tell you, there are very few better training grounds for being a psychotherapist than having worked at Atari. Holy crap. So
you could spend an hour on Nolan just alone.
Nolan, and well, I do talk a lot about Nolan and Ray Kazar and the difference in their mentalities. And each of them had real strengths, and each of them had some blind spots. And it's interesting how Nolan's strengths got emphasized early, and so did Ray Kazar's blind spots. Nolan's blind spots didn't really show up till later. Ray's blind spots showed up pretty quick, and that was unfortunate for Ray. But they were all people just trying to do their best. Now, in terms of blind spots, which I think is what you're talking about, is
yes.
Companies do lack understanding at times of the implications of what they're doing. Part of it is a lack of awareness. They just don't think through or can't grasp the implications. We're in complex systems, and the business world at large is becoming more complex. There are less clear divisions. People are struggling to find boundaries, borders, separations, because that makes it easier for us to think about things. But they're illusions, right? Because the problem is it is one big complex system, and we wreak havoc when we try to use simplistic solutions in complex systems. And that's what happens a lot of times, is people have a clear, simple strategy to move forward in a direction, and they're moving into a very complex space, and so they lack the ability, in some cases I don't know it's possible, for them to predict all the secondary and emergent consequences of what happens. And I think, to your point, that happens again and again and again. I don't know if it's a question of people learning to do better with it. I think it's a question of learning that instead of saying, we're going to do this and make this work, what you need is a reactive approach and be able to say, we're going to put this out and start this path, and let's make sure we are fast enough and quick enough on our feet and able to respond so that as stuff comes up, we can deal with it as quickly and effectively as possible. Because trying to go in with the done solution a priori right from the start, I don't think many people are able to predict that accurately in most systems they enter. And I think that's just the ugly truth of why what you're explaining happens.
Yeah.
I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's still happening. I mean, look at CD Projekt Red or Activision right now. They're still pushing out stuff way too early.
It is gonna keep happening.
It is. Anyway.
It's not getting simpler.
Yeah.
That's a really good point. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for answering my question so comprehensively.
Well, thank you for asking. I couldn't have answered it without the question, I promise. But yes, right there.
Around the time you were making these games, early 80s, were there any games by other people that you particularly enjoyed, whether or not they like industry that you just really into?
That's a good question. When I was making games, I was also enjoying games, that's for sure. And I had a thing called the video triathlon. And so every morning when I got to work, the first place I went was the game room. And I played 3 games, and I played until I got over 100,000 on each game. I wasn't ready to start my day until I got over 100,000 on each game. And those 3 games were Defender, Robotron, and Millipede. Not Centipede, but Millipede, which I always thought was a really excellent sequel. And those 3 games, Eugene Jarvis, best game designer, guys, unbelievable. And those 3 games, to me, those were quintessential games, quintessential basic video games, and I felt I needed to be competent at those 3 games, and that before I sit down at my dev station to do it. So that's what I would do every day. The only time that didn't happen was while I was working at ET. I was actually too busy to do my video triathlon on a daily basis, which really bummed me out.
What do you think of Stargate, like Defender 2 as a sequel?
I was thinking whether I should say that or not. I don't think Stargate is as great. I think Defender is such an essential, pure game, and Stargate felt like adding business to it. Whereas Millipede struck me as a really well-constructed sequel. So I do make that differentiation. So I would put Millipede ahead of Stargate in terms of a sequel, but I would still put Eugene Jarvis ahead of Ed Logg in terms of a game designer. So. Yes?
You mentioned programmer brain earlier.
I did.
And it reminds me of a lot of traits of people on the autism spectrum. Do you think that's why a lot of people who are programmers are on the autism spectrum?
That is a very interesting question. It comes up a lot in therapy circles, too. Because therapists, and this really pissed me off about therapists, let me tell you, because as a person who has their feet in each arena, right, both in the programmer world and the therapy world, there's a lot of therapists where as soon as you say someone's an engineer, they go, spectrum. And it's like, and they're not referring to them as being colorful at that point. And I used to really object to that. I don't like that, because there's a lot of programmers who really aren't on the spectrum, they're just assholes, right? And, you know, so I would say to people, you know, do you know the difference between your Asperger's and a hole in the ground? You know, because people don't know, and a lot of people like simplified, easy diagnoses or things to allocate. I do think there are aspects of programming that people who are on the spectrum, people who have some degree of autistic, you know, you got to differentiate between autism and savantism, okay? Programming savants, you know, a savant is just, you're not going to compete with a savant. They're amazing. But savants are very, very rare, okay? There are aspects of being on the spectrum that would interfere with your ability to program. There are aspects of being on the spectrum that would enhance your ability to program. And although it's true that there are people who are on the spectrum that can do well in technology, there might be a slightly increased representation of spectrum people in the programming world. I don't think it's overwhelming. It's definitely not to the extent of the stereotype that exists. So, and also, you know, we talk about autism very broadly, right? And the reason they call it a spectrum is because there is a wide spectrum of ways that it manifests, ways it comes out. Some of those help, some don't. I will tell you that for people who are autism-inclined programmers, there are aspects of the autism that can help them as programmers. If you're talking about creative, what I would call creative programming, which is programming where you're trying to connect with other people and the experience of the program is different from the functionality of the program. You know, like some programs are like you flick a switch, light comes on, you know it works, there's no ambiguity, no problem there. When you add the it has to be fun, that the experience of your program must be fun to a player, that really changes the dynamic and the composition of what a good developer is. So I do think that some of the same aspects that would make someone a better programmer for very technical things to do, like to do a coin-op conversion, you know, it would be very helpful for that. it might actually be an impediment to someone who is trying to produce new entertainment. I hope that makes sense. Yes, to the, oh, that is just so cute. Good technique.
What's your guys' relationship with Activision?
What's our relationship with Activision like? You mean at Atari?
Yeah, like, specifically with like the engineering department.
That's an interesting question. The relationship with Activision was not nearly as healthy as the relationship with Imagine. Okay? Because some of the people who went to Activision were not super popular people, right? They were really good programmers. And at least one of them was a very personable and fun guy. And I'm not going to name who it was. And these are different people today than they were back then. But back then, these were people who had formed their own little club, and they were sort of aside from. And so the people who formed Activision really were their own group, and they went away, and there wasn't a lot of dealing with them. The people who formed Imagic were very connected people. They were fun people. Actually, one of them was sitting here earlier today, Bob Smith, very good friend of mine to this day. And we were still connected. So as time went on, there were people who left Atari who went to Activision, for sure. And there were some people who left Atari who went to Imagic. But in terms of the relationship of the engineering departments, which is really a pretty cool question, there wasn't really any relationship between Atari and Activision. You know, people who went to Activision had gone to the dark side and they were done. You know, Imagic and Atari went on quite a bit. In fact, there's a little section in the book that talks about a very interesting evening where some Imagic programmers and some Atari programmers got together and shared their pre-release games, which if legal would have ever found out about that would have been an unbelievable explosion that would have cost many people jobs, millions of dollars in fees, and a bunch of unnecessary bullshit, basically. Because nobody stole anything. These were all integrity people who cared about each other, really enjoyed working together, and we enjoyed sharing our work, because that's what we did. You know, we were trying to produce stuff to give to the world, to give to people who would really, you know, when I was growing up as a teenager, I had an experience that very few people in this audience, I suspect, had. Some do. And that is that I didn't know what a video game was because they didn't exist. I'm the last group who grew up without video games. I ruined it for everybody else, right, by making video games. So now there were people who can't grow up without video games. But it's a different life to grow up without video games. If I would have had video games, I might never have grown up because I really would have enjoyed it. But boredom was a horrible, horrible thing for me because I have my own like little issues, and boredom is not something I tolerate well. It took me many decades to learn how to really deal with that. And so what I wanted to do when I was programming a game, I wasn't trying to write a program. I thought of it as entertainment. I thought of it as a broadcast medium. I was trying to do something that would prevent teenagers from having the experience that I had growing up that was really hard for me. And I really couldn't bear it. And so I wanted to alleviate that in people. So this idea of trying to be a healer, the idea of wanting to do something positive for people and improve their lives, I have realized it now as a psychotherapist. It started way back when doing games, it was the same thing. I was trying to create a more positive experience for people in a way that would literally improve their lives in some small way, and I would take joy from the idea of making someone's life better. And I feel that in, you know, just a few million cases, I was able to do that. And that's huge for me. So I know I'm getting very short on time. Yes?
Were there any games that the other people working on it you wish you could have worked on, or games that you wanted to do that you weren't able to?
Not really. The only game I really kind of wanted to do that I never did was a design that I had that I just didn't do. And I really think I should have done it. And so I'm still going to do that because I'm actually going to start working on a new development. I'll let you know that now.
Is it different than the R sequel? Or?
It's the R sequel, yes. I'm still We're still in imagination of figuring out where it goes or how it goes, but I have the completed design doc. I'm very psyched about it, and you will be hearing about that in the future. I know my time is up, so at this point, I am sorry I cannot take more of your questions. I do want to say I'm going to be right next door. I'm going to be doing autographs. I have some copies of my book still. I can sell some of those. I have the DVDs. If I run out of books, if you want, buy the ebook online, show it to me on your phone, I will autograph your phone. I will do that for you. But I just have to say, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure talking. It means a lot to have you here. Thank you.
Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and to the right are the playlist of the Portland Retro 2022 and some other interesting videos. Thank you.